Zahvaljujem se gospođi Mariji Filipović-Žegović, zahvaljujem se svim uvodničarima što su nam praktično nas uveli u današnju temu naše konferencije. Kao kada smo koncipirali program čitave konferencije i tražili na koje teme želimo ove godine da se fokusiramo, negde smo identifikovali nekoliko stvari, a to je da želimo da govorimo o tome kako unaprediti čitav sistem karijernog vođenja i savjetovanja u Republici Srbiji, ali da posebno posvetimo određenu pažnju sektoru obrazovanja kao jednom od sektora u kome je jako bitno i postoji dosta jako bitno uraditi neke inovirane usluge i u kome je jako bitno napraviti neke nove pomake. Tako da razmišljali smo koga da pozovemo da nam o tome govori na ekspertskom nivou iz Evrope i onda smo odlučili da uvaženog eksperta gospodina Johna McCarthyja pozovemo upravo zato što može da nam govori ne samo o smernicama za razvoj sistema na kome je radio u okviru ILGPN mreže, već i o obrazovanju i da nam da praktično u ovoj prvoj sesiji našeg radnog dela jedan uvod o kome možemo dalje da raspravljamo i da diskutujemo u nastavku programa. Zato bih pozvao gospodina Johna McCarthyja iz Međunarodnog centra za razvoj karijere i javne politike da održi svoju prezentaciju.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. You'll excuse me for not having Serbian language, so you will need earphones to listen into the translation, which is excellent. Can I just congratulate the translators because they're doing a really good job. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Serbia. I come from a small island off of the coast of Europe called Ireland. So you're hearing English spoken with an Irish accent. And I hope that won't be too difficult for those of you who know English. In Ireland, we're living on an island, so we like singing and dancing. All right, and while Marco hasn't mentioned that part of my curriculum vitae, okay, it is part of my curriculum vitae. I was very interested in the presentations by the deputy ministers because it reminded me of many things that I could say that I won't be saying that I didn't prepare right in this morning. But I would go along with Marco to say that while the general theme this morning is career guidance and education, you will see as I go through it that I would see career guidance and education as being a subsystem of a national system of career guidance, and all of the parts have to work together. And I think you'll see as my presentation goes along that I will show the interlinking of all of this. So if you're not from the education sector, don't worry. Okay, you're in there. All right. So I'll show that. I also wanted to respond to some of the comments by the deputy ministers. I'm very impressed by the extent to which career guidance is referenced in national strategies and in legislation. All right, and of course we all know that it's actually a big achievement to get them mentioned in either of those, and then it's another step to move from a reference in a strategy and legislation to implementation, and that's where the challenges come in, and that's where you come in, and this is where the exchange of ideas today will all form part of that. I was interested in the youth surveys because the youth survey is really interesting. You mentioned, Deputy Minister, that I think that 19% of young people reported accessing a service. Well, there was in 2014 there was a Eurobarometer survey throughout all of the member states of the European Union, and only 45% of people said that they were able to access services. So 19% is already a good start, all right? But there's a lot to be done, and it's how we do it is really some of the things that we'll be looking at this morning and during the rest of today. You mentioned as well, I think it was the director from Tempus, Maria, mentioned about the visit to Denmark and about the active system in Denmark. And I would suggest you also look at Scotland, all right? Because in Scotland, they're similar to the Irish. They're Celtic, they're Celts, and we watch what they do, all right, and they're really, really good, particularly in the education field and in social inclusion field. They're really, really good. And they have a very active, what I would describe as active career guidance, which is quite different from being in an office and waiting for somebody to come to you, all right? Now, I'm Irish, so I also tell stories. All right, so you'll excuse that we even haven't started the presentation, but I'm on to stories. But some of the stories are instructive. For example, a few years ago, I worked in France with the Ministry of Education to reform the career guidance system in France. And in the career guidance system in France, you have what are known as Centres for Information and Guidance, and they're there for young people and for parents. They're also meant to be for adults, but it's mainly for young people and parents. It's under the Ministry of Education. And they're based outside of schools, and they're open every day from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, which is terrific, except the students are in school, the parents are at work, all right? And when any of them have a chance to talk about these things is probably at mealtime in the evening, and then there's nobody to phone up and to discuss with, all right? So when we talk about passive guidance, that for me is a really good example, okay, of passive guidance. And I think if we look then at other models that we see in other countries, it's more active. So for example, in the case of Scotland, when a young person is at risk of dropping out, the school notifies the career guidance service, which in this case in Scotland is partly in the school and partly outside. And somebody from the career guidance service goes to meet the family, and they try and come up with solutions that are useful for the young person and for the family and for the whole system. All right? And in certain cases, because this brings us back to the word system, our education systems as we have them, I will be saying this later on, but they are historical accidents. They are developed at a particular point in history, and sometimes they lose their relevance over time. And in the case in Scotland, you can imagine, well, if I would look at my own country in Ireland, we would say, okay, somebody's at a risk of dropping out in school, so we'll try and offer them an alternative program, and the alternative program could be in vocational training. But in Scotland, they do it differently. In Scotland, they say, okay, this person, once they're age 16, they really intervene, right? This person, we will see, can we construct an individual program for them? So in other words, they spend 2 days a week in school, they spend 2 days a week in some form of education and training. They may even spend 1 day a week in university just to see what it's like. And they will spend 1 day a week either in paid employment or in unpaid employment. So what they try to do is to look at systems and to try and say, well, all of these institutions are providing education and training in some way, And can we construct it in a different way so that the solutions are more related and will more likely have success, rather than give them, say, well, it's either this or that. All right, we have to look at systems in a way to see how can we make education and vocational training systems more flexible, all right, and in order to try and address these issues, because the issue of dropout is not necessarily only about the content of education and its relevance to the young person. It's also related to their social circumstances, right? And poverty is an issue in Scotland, as it is in other countries, all right? And therefore, trying to find a solution that can meet all of the needs of the young person is quite complicated. So it's not an either or. You either stay in school, or you go into employment, or you become unemployed, or you do something else. In Scotland, they talk about youth engagement. Youth engagement. All right, and I think that's really great, because youth engagement can be engagement in anything, right? It can be engagement in education, in training, in paid or unpaid employment, and trying to and again, they're looking at it, and the Scots, as you know, have a reputation for watching money. All right, I'm not sure if this has reached here, but in Ireland, that's what we would say. They always have a little purse, as you know, and they're around them, and they say that if you don't engage people between the ages of 16 and 24, you risk long-term employment. And the cost of long-term employment is 40 years, all right? Because if you're thinking at age 24, in a normal working life, in kind of Western norms, you might have another 40 years, that's up to age 64. And if you have somebody who is not contributing to taxes, to society, you may, in fact, there may be a heavy charge on the penal system, because they will drop out and they might start doing other activities that don't form, and then you have to pay for their custody as a taxpayer. You have to pay for their health, where they have health problems, and whole social related problems. So they're thinking in terms, oh, well, we've got to intervene early, all right, in order to save money in a long-term perspective. And that's actually quite difficult in governments, because governments usually see their life as 4 years or 5 years, depending on the country that you're in. Sometimes it's 3 years. And in that sense, it has to be more in a kind of a long-term way. And that's why it's really important for if there's anybody here from the ministries who are paid officials in the ministries, it's really important that you keep a focus in the long term like that, and keep raising this issue in terms of investment now to save money later, rather than to say, you know, we will just have a short-term solution to any problem. I think it's really long-term thinking. Now, that's really terrible. I have to say, I'm sorry for digressing, but I had to respond to what you have said, because I think really what you've raised are really important issues, and what I've said might even be more important than anything I'm going to say now. So you'll excuse me for that. Okay, so today I was thinking of, this is typical teacher. I started my life as a teacher, so you'll just hate this, okay? If you hated teachers, you'll just put off. But in general, this is what I'm trying to cover today. I'm going to look a small bit at the rationale for why you should have career guidance in the education system. I'm going to look a small bit around the use of the term of a system of career guidance and a subsystem, and how all of these things relate. And then I'm finally going to look at one of the tools that's used in a larger system, which is the European Union, okay, and how that tool is used, and how that tool could be used by yourselves. So I'm going to start with a question for you, all right? And it's basically, why should career guidance be provided by the government in education settings? So what I'm going to get you to do is to talk to the person next to you, right? And just exchange views for 2 minutes. Why? And you can write down the reasons why. And afterwards, you can check your reasons against the ones that I'll stick up here, all right? So you now have 2 minutes each, okay? Chat to each other and come up with reasons why the government should provide guidance within the education system. I'm sure the Deputy Minister for Education has already given you some of those reasons, all right? But I want you to think it for yourself, all right, and put this. So you have 4 minutes for this. Okay, time is up. I was explaining to Marco that if I had more time, I would go down to you with the microphone and I would just ask individuals for their responses. But we are limited and we have a really charged program, so I'm not able to do that now. But I'm going to give here some reasons, having looked at documents about the education system in Serbia from the internet. There are not really that many on education in Serbia in English. So I may have Wikipedia mistakes in the kinds of answers that I'm going to put up here, but some are related to what the Deputy Minister for Education mentioned. And these are around making choices. So if you look at primary education, one of the objectives of the curriculum in primary education is preparing people for life, work, further education and self-education. And I loved that. I thought that was great. All right. There are certain countries in the world where you will find a curriculum in primary and secondary school and there's no reference to preparing people for work or for life. So I thought this was really good. But it's around making choices within primary education, beyond primary education to the secondary schools, helping people to make choices of high school programs and choices of vocational school programs. I'm sure you have others as well. If we look at secondary education, I couldn't find the objectives in English for secondary education, so I borrowed the ones from primary education because I thought they were good. And again, reorientation within schools. Reorientation is what if somebody makes the wrong choice of program, right, in the first year in secondary, and they say, oh, I've gone into the wrong stream, and I think I'll do social and language instead of maths and science. So, and then the choices beyond, right, and also transitions to the world of work, right, and I've included there migration for work and study, because I think that's really, really important. It's a part of the work in a way that you do in Euro guidance, but it's like coming from an island where we had very high unemployment, and where high unemployment is cyclical. We're a great country for sending young people abroad, right, for work. In fact, the unemployment rate in Ireland would be much higher if all the young people in Ireland chose to live in Ireland. We'd have a huge unemployment rate. So preparation for immigration is as valid a learning as preparation for further study or for work within Serbia. All right, and I'm just putting that out there because it's a reality as well, whether we like to admit that reality or not. In higher education, again, similar reorientation, then further postgraduate study, transition to the world of work, and migration for work and study, right? Because these are all around choices. And for adult education, all right, and I saw there seems to be, I was delighted to see that for the new strategy for education, that career guidance is mentioned within that new strategy. So I think it's really important when we look how to help adults, because adults, when they're going into learning, it's really, really challenging. And those of us who have worked in higher education and in secondary education and in primary education don't really understand some of the challenges that adults face, because their lives are a lot more complex, and the kinds of decisions that they have to make and the balances that they have to make and the choices and the investment of time and effort, money, all right, they're all really key things. And I think it's an area that deserves a little more attention than traditionally it has been given. So reorientation is again around choices and transitions. So I would say that the reasons I've given now are all around choices and decision making. But when we look at policies for education and training, no matter which level, we don't see these words choices, and we don't see guidance tied to these kind of choices. And we can look at reasons, other reasons. I would describe them as systems reasons why you should have career guidance in education. The first thing is mass learning, right? You've got them all together. It's a captive audience. They're like prisoners. They're there in front of you. They're in the classroom, so you've got them, all right? Let's put it like this. You've got the opportunity to get them. Whether you get them is another question, but you've got them there in front of you. And so these are there. And you can also provide a career learning program as a kind of taught learning, peer-to-peer, and experiential learning, which means either some of the things that you're doing already here, such as teaching people entrepreneurial skills to setting up mini companies, right? That's really, really good, all levels of education. And also work shadowing, which I saw mentioned in the documents that you have, really good programs, and work experience programs. So you can plan and organize these things in an education setting that is more difficult to do if the individuals are outside of that. You can promote systematic learning within education, but above all, I would look at other things such as the efficiency of effort and public investment. You can reach people easier, right? And people can have access to services, and also to look at it then in terms of career guidance as a preventative measure. In other words, you try and reduce the chances of errors in decision making and the cost of these errors, because the cost of these errors are enormous. I don't know in Serbia if there's any discussion about the cost of dropout in different areas of education and how public these figures are. Other countries try to hide them, particularly dropout from higher education, because if you look at different levels of education, dropout from primary is less expensive than dropout from secondary, is less expensive than dropout from vocational, is less expensive than dropout from higher education, right? And the costs, because the government invests more money, has to invest more money as the level of education goes higher. The loss, if somebody drops out, the loss becomes bigger, all right, correspondingly. So therefore, if you have early intervention, again, come back to the argument I used about Scotland, if you have early intervention in the education system in primary and secondary schools, you reduce the risks of wasting taxpayers' money. So it's an argument around that, a very strong argument around that. And it would be interesting to see what studies have been undertaken here that around dropout and the cost, all right? And then look also into the reasons why people drop out, because sometimes they are because of errors in decision making, but sometimes they could be for poverty. And so, the reasons aren't simple, they're quite complex and they're interlinked, but I think it's a way to look at the question of early intervention. Now, if we look then at policy objectives, well, when we look at OECD and we look at the European Union and we look at other international research, and we look at what are the kind of performance indicators for policies, right? So, well, the first is kind of the general principles which you have here, like efficient investment in education. This is what career guidance can bring about, right? Social inclusion, social mobility, social equity, gender equality. All of these are kind of values that it supports. And labour market efficiency. And all of these already are in your strategy, as far as I remember, okay, in the national strategy. So this is nothing new. But it's just to recall that it's not only about choices. We're looking at the larger picture, and we're looking at arguments for government, right? Not arguments among ourselves, because we can convince each other here as practitioners that the work I'm doing is really useful and helpful to the individuals and to their families. But we're talking about here is, but how do you transform that argument into arguments for government? And these are the values. And here are some of the looking at the outcomes in education. Here are some of the policy performance indicators. So participation in education, retention in education, program completion rates, performance or achievement rates, right? Progression rates, and transition and progression to the labour market. Even though that last one is tricky, because if there are not a lot of labour market opportunities, then you can't really use that as an easy indicator. But what I'm trying to say is this: the work you're doing as a practitioner, if you're working as a practitioner, right, you have to link that to these performance indicators. So in other words, you're not just working for the individual and for the family, you're working for the government and for the society and for the taxpayer, all right? And you're trying to improve retention rates, you're trying to improve performance rates. And one of the earlier speakers talked about motivating people in the classroom, right? Why? And of course, motivation is related to performance. Right, so in this way, we need to be looking, all right, at the role of career guidance and how it supports these kinds of policies, okay? And not simply when we write documents to ignore this part, because you ignore this at your peril, right? Because if, for example, I was coming in from the IMF, all right, or if I was coming, the International Monetary Fund, or if I was coming in from an outside funder or potential funder of the education system here, or even the employment system, I would be looking at, they'd say straight away, okay, participation rates, retention rates, you know, and you're saying, well, we have career guidance, and they say, we don't want to know that. They say, what we want to know is, you know, how does career guidance contribute, and can you show us how it contributes to retention, to completion, to performance? And therefore, as practitioners working in the education system, you have to link your work to these indicators, not only to say, I'm helping this individual or that individual. So, we're now into the next question, all right? I've done enough talking, all right? So I'm going to give you a question. The word system. And I want to really to get you to reflect about system, because we all talk about systems, but what are we really talking about, and what do we really mean? And I want you to again exchange among yourselves to say, think of an example of a system and say, look, I think this is a system. All right, and the other person said, I'm not sure, and they say, oh yeah, it's a system. Okay, so I want you to look at the word system and think for yourselves, think of examples of what you mean by the word system, and then I will give you some answers. All right, okay. So again, here you have 4 minutes max to do this. Okay. Again, if I had time, I would use the microphone and come down, but we're limited, so I'm not going to do that. But if you Google the word system, you'll come up with many different meanings and forms of it. But it's easy to see. It's easy maybe to see it as a set or a group of interrelated parts or interacting parts. All right. And sometimes these parts might be described as subsystems, and they form a kind of a complex whole, all right? In a way, it appears to look uniform. So we talk, for example, here about the education system. But the education system, in fact, is made up of 4 subsystems, all right? It's made up of primary, secondary, post-secondary, or even 5, adult and university. So, in fact, it's made up in those kind of ways. And there are commonalities, right, and differences in roles, and there are different kinds of links between the different parts of the subsystems. And so, to some extent, they'll share, in the education sector, they'll share some common aims and objectives, but the learning outcomes will be different at different levels, right, for different kinds of institutions. The agencies and the actors will be different according to the system. They'll all share the same administrative responsibility, but sometimes the administrative responsibility is also shared locally, all right, so, and with other actors. The target groups are different, and the institutional culture can be quite different. I mean, the institutional culture in higher education would be quite different from that in adult education. So, you know, so there are commonalities and differences. And we do have tools and instruments that link these subsystems together. So, for example, we have a national qualifications framework, and that links all of the subsystems together. The learning outcomes, the grading of learning outcomes, can also, and linked to the national frameworks, can also be a way that link things together. And we also have national coordination mechanisms, and these might be, you know, a council of education, or, you know, like we have different ways in which all of this is managed. And also, it's important to say that you can see education as part of a larger system, all right? Because while it's a system in itself with subsystems, it's also a significant contributor to the economy as a system. All right, so you know you need to look at it at different levels. The easiest example for me, all right, when you look at that, is to think of the family. Right, and so in the family as a system, right? I have 4 kids, so so you know, so we all have different roles in the family, right? Like we have commonalities, we have differences, we have tools and instruments that link us together. Right, and these as the parents, we force them. Okay, we all have to eat at the same time. Right, so and we chat around the table, and so there are different ways to look to it's, or should I say, that's a very simple example of a system. But if you have difficulty in conceptualizing, think of the family, and I think that will help. If we look then at career guidance. Is there a national system of career guidance in Serbia? And I would say, from reading the documents, it's more like a collection of subsystems, all right, that operate together. And by the way, because of the art in Word, I mean, I could have added on I couldn't add on NGOs, because I know the NGO and civil society here are a really important role. So I put in the 3 main ones: employment, education, and youth. But that is not to say that I don't recognize the importance of NGOs and civil society. So if we look, and in fact, if you look at other countries, by and large, the same is true. Very few countries in the world have a national system that you can really call a national system. Scotland would have, New Zealand has, Wales has, but very few countries would describe themselves as having a national system. Most countries are a collection of subsystems, and they are usually education, training, youth, employment, NGOs, civil society. These are the groups that come in. And again, if we look, there are commonalities and difference between the parts. Their differences might be different target groups. Sometimes they share target groups. They would probably have common aims and objectives. They ought to have common learning outcomes, and that word learning outcomes keeps coming up in my slides. I wonder why. Must be important. Agencies and actors, some same, some different. Funders, all right, some the same, some different. Administrative responsibility, and the tools then that bring these together. And if I was to look at the documents that have been prepared over the last number of years, well, in other countries, you have national frameworks or strategies for career guidance. So that's a tool that brings people together. A shared framework of learning outcomes. A shared framework of social and economic outcomes coming from it, and national coordination mechanisms, right? And my guess is, if I was to look at Serbia, the national coordination mechanism is in its infancy, all right? But that's something that really needs to address. But I do want to say, as I said earlier on, that subsystems themselves are accidents of history. So, for example, in one country, somebody in I give the case of Tunisia, where I've been working recently. In the case of Tunisia, in 1993, the Ministry of Education, somebody within the ministry or some minister decided it was a great idea to have career guidance in education, so let's get started. And suddenly the Ministry of Employment said, I think we should have it too. And so, boom, up, and you have two. And the two grew, right? But they're accidents. Right? They mightn't have happened if these people hadn't really been interested. Right? So, like you look at, or you could describe it as cosmic events, because I wasn't really sure if people appreciate accident of history. But, it's just to say that sometimes, or I say, a lot of the developments of public services, right? A lot of the developments don't come with a pre-planned rationale and have been there from all time, right? They just happen because somebody's been interested, and people say, yeah, it responds, we have a need for that, and we'll keep it going. So if we look at the European Union, you could describe the European Union also as an accident of history, all right? And you could describe it as a cosmic event. So it depends. But if you're looking at the moment, right, it is a collection of subsystems, right? And the subsystems are each country. And each country, they have commonalities, differences, roles, links between the subsystems. So their differences would be history, geography, culture, all right, economy, society and people, government and legal systems, they're not common. Aims and objectives, quite different from country to country. And again, we know that there are some policies which are governed at a European level by directive, all right, because it's a European level competency, and some which are still national competency. And for example, education and employment are national competencies. In other words, each country is responsible for their own employment policy and for their own education and training policy. All right? So the European Union is not in any way in control of that. And we know all the excitement that's going on at the moment with Britain, all right, and all of the kind of resistance to being in Europe. And there are tools and instruments that keep these subsystems together, like the Treaty of the European Union, social, regional, and economic policies. There are coordination mechanisms like Council of Ministers, the European Parliament, right? So there are things then that are in common, like the free movement of goods, people and services. There are different legal agreements around different policy areas. For example, in the agricultural and the pharmaceutical industry, they would be particularly strong. The financial is now becoming even stronger. And you have as also instruments that link them together, Council and Parliament resolutions, where either the Council and the Parliament, or the Council or the Parliament, agree a particular strategy and say this is the way we should go. And we also have at the end of that list, in italics, you can see European reference frameworks and guidelines for different policy areas. And so I'm going to turn to career guidance. Where would you find career guidance? If you were to do a survey of all the existing documentation in Europe on career guidance, where would you find references to career guidance? And you'd find it in education policy in all levels, like, again, secondary, vocational, higher education, right? Adult learning, you'll find around these. Vocational training, very strong references. Youth policy, very strong references. Employment as well. But you also see referenced in social inclusion policies and in entrepreneurship policy. So where would you find then, again, where would you find career guidance within policy frameworks and instruments? And we have council resolutions on education and youth. This means the Council of Ministers, and they have passed resolutions around these. And what's a resolution? A resolution is like a compass. It's non-binding. It gives direction. Right? So if the Council of Ministers agrees that these are really important for career guidance, issues like access, career management skills, quality assurance, coordination, national coordination, it says that. That's what a resolution will say. It's up to the member states then to implement and to do and to follow up. But it gives a general direction. It's a consensus among the Council of Ministers and gives a direction. And the same in general, the European Parliament resolutions can fit in the same way. So it's the same for the Council resolutions on employment. For example, when they pass the employment guidelines, they're saying, all countries, these are guidelines which should help you to improve your employment policy. And there's reference to career guidance within that. And EU policy and strategy documents, again, across a whole range of different areas. And only recently, right, has been developed a set of guidelines for policies and systems development for lifelong guidance. Okay, and so we now have, since last November, right, a reference framework for policies and systems for lifelong guidance. And I'm going to say a small little bit about that. I mean, guidelines in an area where it's non-binding, they're like prescriptions for excellence, right? They're there to inspire people, to inspire thinking, and they're based on the existing knowledge and experience and research and best practice in Europe and beyond. And that's really important to state that, because the guidelines were not developed solely based on the experience of the European Union, but it was looked outside of that and say that. And it's underpinned by certain principles, ones that you already have underpinning your strategy here, social, economic, and citizen-centered principles. And I think that's really important. I think there's a huge emphasis in European terms on, in terms of public services, how is the citizen facilitated by whatever public service is provided, right? A basic question, and I think public services often don't reflect often enough on this particular kind of question. In France, for example, where I live at the moment, people say that the public services in France exist for the public services, which means that they don't seem to really care about the public, all right? They exist for themselves, all right? And so it's a really important way to think around. The services are there for the people. They're not there for the people who are delivering the service, all right? So again, these guidelines can be used for benchmarking, for reviewing, for improving, and they can also be reference points for national policies for education and employment, and training and social inclusion. So in the guidelines themselves, there are 18 guidelines, right? And of these, 4 of them refer to education, different levels of education, school, vocational training, higher education and adult. 3, reference to the employment area, employment and third age, implied as well as unemployed, and social inclusion, youth at risk and disadvantage. And then there are 9 guidelines that are common to each subsystem. So here we have, for example, if you take employment, because I'll take it out of the education system for a moment. For example, to what extent is the career guidance in the employment service here in Serbia supporting the development of career management skills? How can people get easy access to the service? How is that service quality assured? What evidence is collected to show that it's linked to policy objectives, policy performance indicators? What kind of data is collected on its usage? What kind of leadership is there in terms of coordination and planning and links with other subsystems? What is the quality of careers information that's provided, right? And how is it provided and how people can access it? What kind of training and qualifications have people in the National Employment Service have, reference to that? How is it funded? And to what extent is ICT used within that? So you can take any sector, right? Any subsystem. You can take youth, you can take employed people, and you can take higher education, and you can ask the same questions. You can look at these guidelines and say, okay, how does this actually apply across to mine? Each guideline has 4 parts, right? Some guidelines are bigger than others, right? Just to say in terms of content, because we know more about some than we know about others. More research has been done. So usually the guideline defines what is referred to in this guideline. Why is this particular guideline important? Why is guidance in education important? Why is guidance in schools important? Why is guidance for employed people important? What is good practice? What are elements of good policies and systems? Again, take for the employed. What are elements of good policies and systems for guidance for employed people? And then there's a little reference list of materials that are useful for policymakers when they're developing policies on each. I failed miserably last night to convert this, okay, so it's just to say, look, that if you take the first column, the subsystem, all right, you have subsystems there, schools, employed, youth, all right, and you look then and say, okay, well, which guidelines, you can take any of these guidelines or all of these guidelines and examine what's happening in career guidance in schools and say, okay, how does our school system match against the guideline for schools? How does our school system, career guidance in our school system fit in terms of career management skills? How does it work out in terms of access? How is equality assured? How is the evidence collected? What kind of leadership is provided? What kind of careers information? What kind of training qualifications do people have? Funding, and the use of information and communications technology. So that's just to give you an idea. This document, I think outside you saw it in summary form, right? But in fact, I've given you on this PowerPoint, which Marco will make available to everybody. You'll have the website link that you can find the full document. Okay, see if you saw. You have the full document in English here too. Oh, that's really good. Okay, sorry, I didn't see that outside. Thanks, Marco. Okay, so look, so I'm down to my second last slide in a kind of summary. So what we're saying here, right, is that these are all linked together, right? The rationale, why you should have career guidance in any of the subsystems, right? And the characteristics of the existing subsystems that you have. All right, so you have to link the rationale with the existing characteristics and see how they're working, and you can use the guidelines then to use and to look at, you know, how well again, or can we be inspired in any way by the guidelines that might give us another idea that we hadn't really thought about already, and leading down to I would say to a national strategy. And systems development here in Serbia. And I've put it in words, and the words that came out when I was thinking about that, what are the kind of qualities of, you know, what are we trying to achieve in a strategy and in the systems and subsystems? So in linking them all together. And what we're trying to do, I would say, is have a citizen-centered service, have some coherency between all the different parts of the subsystems, have some continuity between the subsystems so somebody doesn't have to tell their story all over again, going from one place to another place, all right? Having commitment from all of the subsystems to work together, having consistency in standards, in outcomes. And I'll just say this word here, because one of the problems with subsystems in any country, and Serbia is not an exception, is that the inputs that are given in education, employment, and youth can be quite different in terms of the training and qualifications and resources, etc., all that are brought in. And that actually is not a real problem. Some people, in some countries, there are civil wars about these things. But I would say that you look at it in the other way, that you focus on learning outcomes. If you can have common learning outcomes, and if you can achieve those common learning outcomes, then the inputs and the differences in inputs is less important, right? So you really need to look at it in maybe a slightly different way. So that's around consistency. So standards is not about, I mean, I'm a psychologist and I know best for you. All right? Okay? That's not it. By the way, I trained as a psychologist, so I know something about that. But I'm just saying, you just can't say, I put on a suit, I'm an expert, I know all the answers. Because I don't. All right? And neither does any guidance counsellor facing an individual that comes up to them. It's a real matter of exploration, exchange, and discovery. So consistency. It's not so much standard driven from the top. It's about learning outcomes in common for everybody and how do we get there. It's about the commonalities, because there are commonalities. So, for example, ICT would be something, access to information and services by ICT is something that should be common to all and should be accessible to all citizens and can improve access. Change, I mentioned that, because things are never the same, all right? If you're engaging in any human endeavor, it's always about change. We're changing for the worse, or we're changing for the better. I'm losing my hair, all right? So I'm getting older, I feel it. So I'm just saying that these systems are the same. Systems are accidents of history or cosmic events, and they change. All right? And they change because sometimes technology changes them and changes the way that we approach things. And the last thing is convergence. All right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to, in a way, get the existing subsystems to converge maybe around learning outcomes in a citizen-centered way for services. All right? So if you look at it like that, and that's in fact what we try to do in Europe in a broader sense in Europe. In Europe, each education system is different. It's different, right? But what we try to do is try and get a convergence in some kind of ways, such as a European qualifications framework, so that people can migrate for work or study from one country to another quite easily, all right? So I will stop at that, okay? I've really gone over time, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be delighted to answer questions, I think, later in the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, John, very much. Thank you for giving the presentation, but also for inspiring the talks and discussion between the audience. Hvala vam puno, Johane, na ovom obraćanju i